And just to recap our survivorship curves, type 1 are typically that case-selected species, or things that have high parental care. We have a lot of individuals that survive in the beginning. They tend to grow, and then they tend to die off at old age. So look at the age from birth till an older age. Typically, they survive, and they continue to survive. There's a lot of investment put into those organisms to allow them to survive. We have our R-selected species, which have a rapid die-off. They produce tons and tons and tons of individuals, but they have rapid die-off, and not many of them make it to an old age. So our mosquitoes and dandelions and things like that. And then we have our things that just fall sort of right in the middle. They have sort of equal amount of being able to live and die from both a young age and an older age. A metapopulation is a group of spatially distinct populations that are connected by occasional movements of individuals, and they move. This term is corridors, which are strips of habitat that allows organisms to move. Examples are things like cougars, which are also called mountain lions or pumas. It's all the same organism. This is this nice little picture that it has here. Patches of mountainous habitat in deserts, so you have these cougars that have their own space. Allows them to have enough access to water because it's sort of desert-like, and access to mule deer. But it's important that these populations are allowed to interact with one another. Helps protect them from being wiped out. Other things that do this are butterflies that specialize on certain plants that grow in clumps, or things like amphibians that live in temporary wetlands. And this is increasing because humans are increasingly fragmenting the habitat. So looking at community ecology, there's factors that determine distribution of species. Things like the species' fundamental niche, the abilities, the interactions with other species, and the abilities to disperse to an area. Things like community ecology, which is the study of the interactions of an organism, which determine the survival of a species in a habitat. I'm going to break this down into some specifics. An ecological niche is the totality of an organism's adaptations, its use of its resources, and the lifestyles to which it is fitted. It takes into account all aspects of an organism's existence. There's two different types. There's the fundamental niche, which is the potential idealized, this is all the things that I would like to have. And then there's the realized niche. This is the actual niche that the organism occupies. This is the actual space that we see it living in. This is an important graph. It's not in this chapter in this book, but I wanted to go over it now. It's any environmental resource that, because it is scarce or unfavorable levels, restricts the ecological niche of that organism. So we have this optimum, and this is where we're going to find the abundance of individuals. So whatever this limiting factor is, whether it's water, whether it's food, whether it's habitat. So if we're looking at we can have too much of a good thing, and so we'd have few individuals here, and eventually we get to no individuals, and we can have too few of something, too little. So if we're looking at water, for example, we have an optimum amount of water, but we could have some, if there's flooding, and if there's extreme flooding, no individuals would be able to survive that. Whereas if there's drought, we'd have a few that could make it, and then we'd eventually have no individuals that would make it. Looking at interspecific interactions, and we're going to go through all of these in detail. But if we look at competition, predation, mutualism, and commensalism, if we look at the two species, competition is not good for either of them. Predation, it's good for the predator and bad for the prey. Mutualism, they both benefit, and commensalism is where one species benefits and the other one isn't harmed. So looking at competition, again, we have Gauss's competition principle. He was still working with his paramecium. It's the struggle of an individual to obtain a limiting resource. So he took his paramecium here and he said, let me see how many individuals I have if I just grow this one. And let me see how many individuals I have if I just grow this one. And he found what their carrying capacity was, grown separately. But then when he decided to grow them together, you can see that one, the bigger paramecium, was able to out-reproduce, out-dominate the smaller paramecium. So one species will perform better. Resource partitioning. This is a little further down here. So it's when two species divide a resource based on differences in the species' behavior or morphology. So they are going to divvy up the resource based on things that they choose to do or adaptations that they have. Species in nature reduce resource overlap via temporal or spatial or morphological resource partitioning. We'll take a look at all of these really quickly here. So looking at this graph here, we have two different species and how they divide a resource. So it's based on differences in the species' behavior or their morphology. So natural selection will favor individuals that overlap less with other species in the resources they use. Okay, so here we have overlap and here we don't. So let me explain what's going on with these two graphs. We have two different species of birds and they eat seeds of different sizes. So species 1 is represented there in blue. And he eats small seeds and medium seeds. And then species number 2 is yellow, and he gets to eat medium seeds and large seeds. And if species 1 is the better competitor, so here's their overlap, they both like the medium seeds, so that's green. If species 1 is the better competitor for medium seeds, he's going to sort of dominate and get to win those medium seeds. Species 2 is going to go through some evolution and start to favor larger seeds. Okay, if we look at like morphological resource partitioning, this is Darwin's finches. So Darwin's finches like to eat, seeds, but all of their beaks evolved to eat specific things. So all these finches came from the same area, but they adapted so that they could eat different things. And then there's spatial resource partitioning. These birds all like to live in the same type of tree, but they choose to live in different parts. So this warbler likes the bottom part. This guy likes the top and just the sides. This guy likes, this middle part. This guy only likes the tops and not even the sides. And this guy likes the middle interior part. So they all use the same tree, but they all use different parts of that same tree. Wolves and coyotes do this. They hunt at different times of the day. Plants flower at different times of the year so that they can get pollinated. Desert plants have roots, some that are shallow and copious versus some that are deep. And so now let's go back to look at, we did competition and then we looked at some resource partitioning, and now we're going to go back and go through these species interactions. So there's 5 of them. We did competition where we looked at the paramecium, and then we looked at some resource partitioning. Now we're going to go back and look at predation. So predation is one species is a resource for another one. All different organisms of all sizes can be predators. Okay, so we have 4 different types of predators. There's 4 types. The first one is the true predators. This is what we think of. They kill their prey and consume it. The lion eats the gazelle. That's a true predator. But herbivores are also predators. They consume plants. So things like gazelle eat plants. The gazelle that the lion just ate is a predator of plants. There's parasites, which live on or in the host, but they rarely cause death. Things like tapeworms or pathogens that can cause disease or viruses or bacteria. They don't want to kill their host because then that's not going to be good for them either. And then there's the parasitoid, which lays its eggs in another organism. So things like a wasp flies lays its eggs in a certain type. Different types of predation. There's pursuit versus ambush. Pursuing place means you chase it down and you catch it. Okay, so that day gecko chases down that spider until he gets a chance to eat it. And ambush is when predators catch prey unaware. So they camouflage themselves and then they attract prey with color or light, so rather than chasing them down. Of course, things don't want to get predated on, so they have defenses. Both plants and animals have defenses. Plants can't run away, so they need adaptations like spikes, thorns, leathery leaves, thick wax, protective chemicals that are poisonous or things that organisms don't want to eat. And animal defenses, well, let's just run and run faster. Mechanical defenses, like they have spines, like a porcupine. Living in groups. Camouflage, so that they can hide. And then chemical defenses, such as poisons, or mimicking organisms that have that chemical defenses. Mutualism is our third type of interaction, and it benefits both two interactive species by increasing both species' chances of survival or reproduction. Example is acacia trees and ants. The ants are good for the acacia tree, and they both benefit. The ants will help defend that tree. And plants and pollinators are another example. We also have lichen, coral reefs. They also fall into mutual benefits. Commensalism. One species benefits, but the other is not harmed or helped. Examples are birds that perch in trees. Doesn't hurt the tree. The bird needs to perch there. Fish hiding in a reef. Doesn't do anything to the reef, but the fish are protected. And then we have keystone species. It's a species that plays a role in its community that is far more important than its relative abundance may suggest. So something like, it's not usually the most abundant or a major energy producer. They can be predators, they can be sources of fuel, it can be mutualistic. They can provide some other essential service. Examples are starfish. They prey on the mussels. This was looked up in Washington State. And when the starfish were removed, the mussels reproduced so rapidly because when starfish ate the mussels, it cleared space for other organisms. Without the starfish there, the mussels overproduced and 25 species died. Beavers can also act that way by damming rivers and forming water behind that allows other organisms to survive there. Another keystone species is the gray wolf. Wolves were hunted to extinction. Populations of herbivores increased explosively. So things like your deer went crazy. There was lots of overgrazing and some plant species disappeared. You lost a whole lot of insects. Gray wolf was an endangered species, but now that the population has made some coming back, hunting of the gray wolf has been okayed in both Indiana and Montana. And then we're going to take a look at succession. So ecological succession, we looked at this outside early on in the year because we had to do it before the leaves fell off the trees. It's the predictable replacement of one group of species by another group of species over time. And so primary succession occurs on surfaces that are initially devoid of soil. So things like abandoned parking lots, rock from glacial melt that hasn't been exposed yet, or lava. The process is that there's bare rock, and it's colonized by organisms, by lichen and moss. Those are the most important ones that are there. And then it's going to go through where lichen and moss are going to allow it to develop a little bit of soil that will allow some weeds to come in. Those weeds will die, add some more organic material to it. Remember, it takes a long time for soil to develop, so this is a long process. And then wildflowers and nutrients, shrubs, and then we go to trees that produce a lot of sun, and then our old forest, beech, maple, those sort of things. Secondary succession is the same thing, but it occurs in areas that have been disturbed but have not lost their soil. So these are things like fires, hurricanes, abandoned fields. It's going to follow the same exact pattern, except it doesn't have to start with the bare rock and the lichen. We're going to just sort of start with those annuals. So there's small plants, which is going to go to then grasses and perennials. Then go to grasses and shrubs and young oaks, and then mature oak and hickory forest. And look at that time frame. It takes a really long time. Looking at Yellowstone, which has burned significantly, we've been there. It's still in this 5 to 150 year stage. And then the climax communities, the community scientists used to believe ended succession, but since so many things can happen to communities, that doesn't necessarily happen. Aquatic ponds can also go through the same sort of succession. They slowly become terrestrial habitat. And then looking at factors that determine species richness, latitudes, as we move towards the poles, the number of species declines. They don't really know why. It's getting colder, but we have more organisms at the equator. Time will influence it. Species richness is influenced by time. The longer the habitat exists, the more things that can colonize it. Habitat size, larger habitats contain more species, can support more species, and then distance from other communities. Islands that are typically far away from other ones typically have lower species richness.